Thanks very much to Pauline. I'd now like to welcome Assistant Professor Bruce Arnold to speak. So Assistant Professor Arnold is from the University of Canberra School of Law and will be talking to us about a very topical topic, which is access to essential medicines after the Trumpocalypse.
Okay, so it's almost 100 years since a European philosopher, amid an outbreak of populism that ended very, very badly, exhorted his readers to embody pessimism of the intellect and optimism of the will. In essence, he was calling for a commitment to political change without disengagement and without indulgence in a utopian belief that the revolution is just around the corner or readily achieved by discourse among the pure of heart. In essence, he was calling for an ethic of responsibility. In this presentation, I'm going to offer a somewhat gloomy view of what I've rather cruelly dubbed the Trumpocalypse, policy development and implementation under US President Donald Trump, and its implications for access to essential medicines in both the global north and global south. And I think it's important to recognise that we need access to essential medicines in the US and Canada and Belgium and Australia and New Zealand, rather than just some of the places we've heard about today, the Sahara, for example. The optimism in this presentation involves my contention that we can address short-term regulatory incoherence and long-term institutional incapacity. And indeed, if we've embraced the insight provided by John Rawls, Martha Nussbaum, and Michael Kirby, we must address those problems. So in the coming 10 minutes, I want to step outside the specifics of patent law and the international trade agreements. Instead, I'm suggesting that we consider soft power regarding enhanced access to essential medicines. That power is a matter of reputation, it's a matter of legitimacy, and sustained critique. Critique is, after all, what academics should do. Critique is important given misplaced claims that what takes place in academic seminars or subsequent tweets is irrelevant. So let's look first at incoherence. Policy contradictions that mean some political agendas, the agendas of Donald Trump, are simply unachievable. President Trump, the William Jennings Bryan of our Gilded Age, entered office promising to, and I'm picking up sort of specific comments here, he's going to slash red tape. He's going to shrink bodies such as Food and Drug Administration and the Federal Trade Commission. He's going to substantially reduce drug prices. He's going to accelerate the approval of new drugs. And, very cleverly, he's going to ensure fair rather than free trade. And so, for example, and I'm quoting directly now, we're going to be cutting regulations at a level that nobody's seen before, and we're going to have tremendous protection for the people. Trump promises we can save tens of billions of dollars. The pharmaceutical industry, which prior to recent private meetings, the president had recurrently described as, quote, getting away with murder, that industry apparently need not worry, given his public reassurance that, and again I'm quoting, you people are going to do great. You're going to do great. Some of his advisors have gone a bit further. They've indicated, for example, that the only criterion for drug approval should be that a product does not harm, and the efficacy of the drug is irrelevant, something that should please vendors of homeopathic pills and potions, but I suspect might disconcert the FTC or bodies in Australia such as the ACCC. Now, Trump's version of the pharmaceutical Big Rock Candy Mountain apparently involves cheaper drugs for US consumers, lower costs for health service providers, bodies that in many instances are the ones that are paying for those drugs rather than the US government, an increased return on investment for major and emerging drug companies, quicker time to market for innovation, or what's claimed to be innovation, stronger barriers to imports, and apparently expectations that offshore production will somehow magically repatriate to the US homeland. It's almost an autarkic system. Now, my contention is that several of those policy objectives are contradictory and thus unachievable, irrespective of whether Trump gains congressional support. And we should remember that in health policy, Congress does have some impact here. Now, that policy incoherence is exacerbated by Trump's apparent commitment to cutting and as importantly, severely chilling the public sector. In particular, he's foreshadowed substantive cuts to the US Food and Drug Administration, the Department of Health and Human Services, and the Federal Trade Commission. After all, they're just bureaucrats and they just play around all day with red tape. And that regulatory incoherence is not new. The FDA, for example, currently hasn't filled 1,000 positions, and that's roughly 8% of its formal establishment. So yes, Trump is alarming, he's perplexing, he's caused at least one of my students to say WTF, but there is some historical continuity here. The incapacity is not unique to the US. Australia's Therapeutic Goods Administration has lost expertise along the willingness to ask some hard questions about domestic and overseas product suppliers. It's an erosion of effectiveness that's evident in at least 4 inquiries, and that weakens its resistance to regulatory capture. We can see the same incapacity in overseas regulators of essential medicines. For example, India's failure to address substantive production problems involving Ranbaxy and Sun, corporations that are exporting all over the world, where you may recall there was evidence of systemic data falsification, large-scale product contamination, bribery, and of course disregard of standards. So I think we need to be a bit wary of the view that self-help in the South will necessarily offset essential medicine policy failures in the North. Trump's potential hollowing out of bodies such as the FDA, FTC, and I suppose the Department of Justice is, I suggest, more pernicious for access to medicines than his rhetoric about costs, prices, and offshore supply. Daniel Carpenter, who's a leading writer on the FDA, has, in my opinion, quite astutely argued that the FDA's power is ultimately founded on perceptions of its legitimacy rather than its statutory authority. That legitimacy is a matter of soft power. It reflects an awareness within the community, within industry, academia, media, and officialdom of the importance of the FDA's mission. Homeopathic potions, after all, won't harm you. On the other hand, fake antimalarials or antipsychotics and misprescribed pharmaceuticals such as thalidomide are quite another matter. Legitimacy also reflects an awareness of the FDA's resistance to the sort of regulatory capture that seems to be espoused by Trump, where you're going to do great, you're really going to do great. It's a legitimacy at odds with the post-truth ethic, in which policymakers are not reprimanded for disregarding facts and are indeed rewarded for statements that, if they were made in the course of trade and commerce, would be regarded as egregiously misleading and deceptive. We should accordingly be concerned with a White House that erodes the legitimacy of drug regulators or of climate scientists, and that denies those regulators the tools needed to carry out their mission and thereby retain their legitimacy. Given regulatory emulation, we should also be concerned that policymakers in other countries possibly such as India, or indeed in Australia, will embrace the Trump model. They should not, for example, misread US developments as meaning that there are no substantive harms if domestic supervision of generic and patent-protected production in India, Bulgaria, China, and other locations is weakened. Similarly, that some harms, such as China's recurrent milk powder scandals, are an acceptable price. Regrettable, but when it comes down to it, an acceptable price for global competitiveness in a world where the White House seeks to build a pharmaceuticals trade wall around the US to accompany the wall along the US-Mexico border. And I'm just about to run out of time, aren't I? Another minute? Okay. So I've suggested that the White House's ostensible objectives in the US market, cheaper drugs and so on, are unachievable in the next 4 years. We're likely to see policy flip-flops, compromises and carve-outs, irrespective of whether Congress is compliant. I suggest, however, that the erosion of the institutional capacity of regulators is likely to affect public health within the US and elsewhere beyond Trump's time of office. And my contention is that resistance at the national and international level over the coming decade offers a basis for building a more just global pharmaceutical access regime. And if we have time for questions, I'm happy to talk about what that resistance might involve, but I'm not going to take up the next speaker's time.